I believe we can resolve the energy, let's call it, of an experience and transform it into love. And that's the resolution, is when we take that bound up, contracted, depressed, rageful, betrayed, whatever that energy is, when we can transmute that into a energy of love, to me, that is resolution.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Savannah family. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for all the love you give the show. Today, we're talking about healing after loss. As humans, we experience loss in our life, and often these losses go unacknowledged, whether it's the loss of a pet, a job, a relationship, or the death of a family member. Today, author Melanie Phillips is here to share with us that healing after loss is not a linear process. She opens up about her personal journey after the unexpected loss of her partner, and she provides us with tips on how we can enlist the right kind of support when we're in crisis, and how we can also best support others who are in need. We discuss loss from the perspective of the chakra system and energy medicine. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how to navigate loss, grief, or any really challenging situation in your life from a more empowered perspective, I'd encourage you to keep listening. As I mentioned, our guest is Melanie Phillips. She has 18 years under her belt as an Ayurvedic practitioner, yoga teacher. She works one-on-one with clients online in her Ayurvedic yoga training and retreats and workshops around the world. She just authored her second book, and it's a best-selling book, Living After Loss, A Soulful Guide to Freedom. Before we hop into today's episode, I just want to remind you how you can support the show. The best way is to make a purchase on SavannahSpirit.com. Savannah Spirit helps support the podcast. That's why this podcast is able to come to you. So the product I'm highlighting today is their crystal cleansing smudge kit. I get asked all the time about how to cleanse crystals, and smudging is a fantastic way. So this crystal cleansing smudge kit on Savannah Spirit includes also some stones, amethyst and clear quartz, as well as 2 white sage bundles. Check it out, or use that code podcast30 to get anything you want on SavannahSpirit.com and also help support the show. And again, your ratings and reviews here mean a lot. So if you haven't yet given a rating or review here on iTunes, take a moment to do that today, and let's dive into our conversation with Melanie. Melanie, thank you so much for being here, for coming back on the show. What prompted you to write this book, Living After Loss?
Yeah, so I've just recently published Living After Loss, A Soulful Guide to Freedom. And as much as it's a book about grief and loss, it's really a book about resiliency as well. So there's so many different layers to loss and to grief and any kind of life challenges. There's even life challenges that we don't necessarily cognitively think of as loss. And I work with many people one-on-one that might tell me about, an abortion they had in their past, or the death of their cat, and these things which we're sort of entrained to just move on with. And we don't necessarily realize sometimes how much loss there is in our life. It could be the loss of a dream, the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship. Typically, we think of loss as something, big and major and dramatic and traumatic, like a death or a divorce. But it doesn't have to be. I think there's so many layers to loss. And unless we are able to recognize the impact that loss has on us, then these losses can accumulate throughout our life.
What spurred writing this book for you? Did something happen in your life particularly that made you want to write this book?
Yeah. So before I had the idea, what really spurred the idea of the book was the sudden and truly unexpected suicide of my partner. And after that life event and that trauma, I knew right away that I had to write a book. It wasn't like, I want to write a book about grief and loss. It was, I knew that was what was going to happen. And then it was some years that it took to write the book and to actually get it out in the world and to formulate the way in which I wanted to speak about the subject. And as I was beginning to write the book, I realized, as I was just mentioning, there's so many losses, even in my own life, even before the death of my partner, there were a lot of other losses that I didn't really necessarily think of as loss. Some of them I did. I was married and had a divorce and went through a messy divorce, and that felt very difficult for me in my life. And I also went through a near decade-long autoimmune condition. And for me, that felt like a big loss of my health and my youth and my desire and my dream to dance professionally. So when I began to write the book, I realized, gosh, there's been a lot of loss in my life. I realized there is for a lot of people.
Right. And that those losses, I think what you were saying before, like they're not acknowledged. You just kind of plow through life, and our culture and our society right now just really values this like go, 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 achieve type of mentality. And no one's really ever saying like, you should slow down. You should take some time to reflect and acknowledge, what you're letting go of, because we let go of so much over a lifetime, like you're saying.
Absolutely. And, even jobs, like maybe you lose your parent dies and you get a week off or something, and you're expected to get back to work and move on with things. And my experience of grief and loss is that it's not linear, and it does take time, and we can't predict what anyone's grief pathway is going to look like.
Melanie, what do you really want listeners to know about loss? Like, I think you just saying it's not linear is hugely helpful. Like, I already feel like, yeah, that's true. But what else have you found to be deeply true as you've gone through this exploration?
I've found that we can't do it alone, that we need the right kind of support, and that's going to look different for everybody. For me, after my partner killed himself, most people were like, oh, well, you should go see a counselor. And that's sort of what our society buys into. And I did go to see a counselor, and I went for a few sessions to this one well-meaning woman. But it felt like I was re-traumatizing myself every time I went to see her. And my background is also, I'm an Ayurvedic practitioner, I'm a yoga teacher, trainer, and I'm an energy healer. So I, even before the death of my partner, had proclivities towards energy medicine and healing. So I began to really pursue the form of my healing in the form of energy medicine. And that, I feel, was one of the most profound things to help me shift on an energetic, like on a deeper level than just talk therapy. And I'm not bashing talk therapy. That might be really useful for somebody. For me personally, I found that it amplified the pain and the suffering, and it didn't help in the transformation of that energy.
So talk a little bit more about what the energy of loss feels like in the body. I mean, is it related to a specific area, a certain chakra? The Savannah listeners are pretty sophisticated, as you know, in terms of, this deep yogic wisdom. So I'm curious, how would you describe the energy that's associated with loss? And then what did it begin to feel like? Like, what kind of practices were you doing when you start talking about energy medicine to shift?
Yeah, great question. I think I can not say what anyone's experience will be of loss, but I can tell the listeners about mine. My experience of loss in my physical body was after my partner's suicide, and it was complicated because we didn't actually find his body for weeks on end. And I talk about this in the book, and the trauma that kind of got layered on top of just the loss of him and the other challenges that went along with this strange sort of him going missing and suicide. So my body shook for weeks. Like, it literally shook. And luckily I knew enough to allow my nervous system to sort of off gas, to move the trauma through my body in that shaking form is very healthy.
I have to interrupt you, Melanie. I'm sorry, but it's so interesting you say that, because one of my big passions beyond teaching yoga and running teacher trainings, like very similar to you, is myofascial release. And my big teacher in myofascial release, John Barnes, he talks about this a lot, about how animals, when they're wounded in the wild, they go through this shaking, and it's literally like the trauma of a wound, or a gunshot, or whatever it may be, like exiting their tissues, and that it is so important for the healing process. And there's all these studies of people waking up from anesthesia, like waking up from surgeries, and they're just shaking profusely. And, in hospitals, people like don't know what to do, so they like strap them down and that kind of thing. But it's really like essential to healing. So it's so interesting to me that you're saying this and that you experienced this. Was this right away, or like did you have reoccurring episodes of shaking over a course of weeks or months?
Yes, it went on for weeks and months, and then eventually eventually, as my nervous system became more regulated, it dissolved over time. And this is the thing with healing. We have to look to the nervous system. And if our nervous system is in a dysregulated state, then our trauma will be regurgitated through our system. So one of the keys in our healing is, how do we regulate the nervous system? If we're speaking from, a subtle body chakra perspective, we can experience grief, loss, and trauma in any of the chakras. And the reality is, even though we talk about the main 7 chakras a lot in yoga, they're all one system. So even though we can talk about them separately, they're all influencing and being influenced by one another. So if there's a impact in the heart chakra. So for me, the death of my partner had a really strong impact on my heart chakra, but also in my root chakra, my base, like my foundation of reality, was altered in a moment. And my roots, my connection, I had to move. I had to leave our home. I had to move our apartment and find a new place to live. Everything was uprooted. So my entire energy system was distorted and dysfunctional after that major loss.
Yeah, no, I can see how both heart and root chakra, I mean, just your stability, your partner being gone. I mean, I can't even imagine. And it's interesting that, like, when the shaking was happening, did you intuitively know that this was part of the healing process, or were you freaked out? I mean, what was going through your head in those moments?
I don't think I was freaked out, because everything was so chaotic and surreal anyway. And that as the shaking would come, I think I just knew deep down on a primitive, intuitive level that this had to move through, that this was okay, and that there's no need to suppress it. And in fact, if I tried, I couldn't really, I couldn't suppress it. I had to move it through. But I also did some things to help provide a container for that. So, in yoga, sometimes we might use sandbags on the ankles, or in like restorative practice, we might use weight on the body. And weight is very good for trauma and for shock and for balancing in Ayurveda, what we'd say vata dosha, the air and ether. If there's stress, then weight on the body is going to be, generally speaking, is going to be nourishing and provide a container for that dysregulation of the nervous system. So me even like putting something heavy on my thighs when they would begin to shake, it wasn't that I was trying to stop the shaking. It was that it was like me kind of contacting my nervous system saying, I see you, I feel you, it's okay, you do what you need to do. And I'm going to give you a little bit of support here with this weight.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I have vata as my dominant dosha, and sandbags have been completely transformative for my practice. I mean, I think really weighing yourself down, whether you're going through a loss or not, is hugely helpful for anyone who's listening who knows that they have vata in their prakriti. So Melanie, I want to go a little bit back to what you said before about like the right kind of support. So it's like you're going through this and people were telling you to see a counselor. I mean, when you talk about the right kind of support, and then you talked a little bit about like energy medicine, how could like your regular family members or regular friends support you? Or was it something that you it sounds like maybe it's something you have to go inside and do like your own personal energy work. I'm just curious to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, it was both. So in the initial stages, there was no way I could go and support myself. Like I needed, and there was no way I could sit down and meditate. And that those ideas or suggestions were ludicrous at the time. There's no way. I remember a family member saying, well, why don't you just sit down and read a book? And I thought I actually couldn't read for probably a few months. I just couldn't read. I couldn't focus. My brain, something had been affected literally in my brain, in my psyche, that everything shut down except for the survival mechanisms. So when I talk about getting the right support, that will be different for everybody. And it's about listening to what is right for you, no matter what other people are telling you. Friends and family will be very well-intentioned, and sometimes they can say and do things that are actually very hurtful. I had a few experiences where friends were very hurtful and said very damaging things, and were trying to, just get over it, and you've got a great life, and you should be happy, and all these things that are not helpful or supportive. Or family might say, oh, everything happens for a reason. And these things are not supportive to the one suffering in that moment. Even if they may be true, we can't gloss over it. And I would say for people that are supporting someone going through loss or trauma or grief or suffering, is just to be with them, and also to ask them, what do you need? I had a friend say, I just don't know how to support you. And she was being very kind of like tough love, and it wasn't what I needed at all. And I just said, why don't you ask? Why don't you ask me? And then the other part of it is to offer your support, to say, and not expect anything in return, not expect that person grieving to respond, to be any kind of version of themselves that you once knew, to really just give them the space to go into the darkness, to be seen and witnessed in the darkness without having to pull them out. So often people are uncomfortable with others' grief that they're like, try to make it better and try to fix or try to kind of cheer them up. And in a way, we're stealing that experience from the one going through the loss of the grief by trying to rush through it or push them into a state that isn't helpful. So if we can really just be with someone, maybe you don't even say anything, you just sit in a room with someone. And that can be so deeply healing.
Yeah. Or maybe bringing food. What do you think about that idea?
Exactly. Sorry, that's where my mind was going, was yes. And to also just sometimes it's not appropriate to ask because that person in deep grief may not have a clue how you can support them. And that's really the time to say, look, I'm going to make this lasagna on Thursday. I'll bring it over at 5 p.m. I'm going to drop it off at your doorstep. If you want company, I'll come in. And if not, I'm just leaving it. No questions asked, not a word, like, here it is. This is my gift. This is my offering. And to follow through with those things and to just do it and take the initiative to do those things, because likely that person has a hard time feeding themselves, has a hard time maybe bathing even, or cleaning their house.
Like going back
those
to the root chakra,
things.
right? Yeah, like the survival things. That's what made me say food, right? I mean, and it's interesting because if you look in, throughout time, it's like people bringing food to one another, or food at funerals. That's like a common theme through so many cultures. But I think it's often lost in these modern times, and it's just so basic. Or saying like, I'm going to send a house cleaner to clean your entire house for you, or something like that. Like focusing on that root chakra level of care is just so important if you don't feel comfortable to ask. So those are some great tips. Thank you for sharing those, because I think we all know people who are going through a loss at some time or another, and it can be really hard to like know how to support that person. And when you're grieving, it can feel so isolating, even though people have been through loss before, that you're not the only one. And was that your experience? I mean, you just feel so alone.
Absolutely. And in a way you are, because no one can ever understand your experience. I had, again, well-intentioned friends saying, oh, well, when my father died or this, and they're trying to connect. And to me in that moment, it felt like such a dishonoring of my experience. It's like I didn't want to hear about their loss in that moment. I wanted to be in my experience and have that validated and not undermined by someone else's experience. So
that trying to connect. Yeah, especially it's like interesting. Do you agree? I think especially like in maybe the yoga or the spiritual community a little bit, people are often like they really want to connect on that level. But like you're saying, sharing the anecdote of like, when this happened to me, I felt that way. It isn't necessarily always helpful to the person you're sharing that with. So, I mean, do you have any tips for those friends, for example, like how could they have connected with you in another way? Is it really just like kind of the root chakra support we were talking about, or are there other things?
Well, and I think it's just I had some really amazing friends and family that could just sit with me and could not have to impose their discomfort or anything on top of my situation, but to really just sit in presence and to witness whatever is needed at that time, whatever pain the one suffering is going through, without saying, oh, it's going to all get better, or this, everything happens for a reason, and all those cliches that
it's like someone to bear witness.
Exactly.
Bear witness to what you're going through.
And I believe that in other times and cultures, we've had that set up through community, and now it's very lacking. So just to have someone bear witness to your suffering, and I speak about this in the book as well, that is such an important part of the healing. I don't believe we're supposed to, go away in isolation, heal, clean everything up, and then come out the other side with a big smile on our face. I don't believe that's the way. I believe that through our own process of suffering and of being in grief without having to fix it, change it, alter it in any way, is a deep honoring. And I believe, from my experience, that it will allow us to move through the pain in a more easeful way.
Yeah, I really agree with you. And I mean, our culture is so uncomfortable with discomfort, right? I mean, it's like every product that's advertised to us, like everything we see is all about like solve your problem and your discomfort right now by, buying this or doing this or whatever. So, to sit and just bear witness to someone else's pain and suffering without trying to change it and being okay and strong enough to do that in your own physical and energetic body is huge. I want to ask you about something you said earlier about the grieving process not being linear. And so many books you read about grief kind of hand you like this recipe of stages, right? Like stages that you'll go through. Have you found that to be true for you? Like that there's sort of a method to the madness, or was that not your experience?
Not my experience.
So there's no breakdown of like the denial stage and anger and, something like that.
No, because it's cyclical. And so it's not like, ooh, went through the anger and denial, check, I'm done. It's like we keep cycling around through these various energies and emotions and experiences. So I don't believe that we can look at it in that linear way. It isn't like that. And, some people, even if they haven't had what we might consider like a major loss, maybe a life challenge, let's just say for the sake of this conversation, I've had so many clients come and say, I thought I was over that. I thought I did the work on that piece of my life or experience. I thought I was kind of over that. And the healing is, I believe, our relationship to the experience, to the incident, to the situation, to the loss. And that's when that begins to shift, that's the healing. So my relationship to the loss of my partner is so different than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And to me, that's the signature of healing is how am I in relationship to this experience? How am I now not only telling the story, but physiologically, psychologically, psycho-emotionally, energetically in relationship to this experience?
You preempted my next question, which is so amazing because I was going to ask, can we ever reach resolution? Can you ever fully recover from a loss? And I think you already gave the answer, which is, I'm guessing you can shift your relationship to what happened.
Exactly. And I think everyone's going to use loss and challenges and grief differently in their life. For me, in some ways, I feel more integrated, connected, and whole than I ever have. And so I don't know if like the word resolution is the resolution. Yes, I believe we can resolve the karma. I believe we can resolve the energy, let's call it, of an experience and transform it into love. And that's the resolution, is when we take that bound up, contracted, depressed, rageful, betrayed, whatever that energy is, when we can transmute that into a energy of love, to me, that is resolution.
That also sounds like alchemy. So tell us a little bit about that transformation now. And I'm guessing that's going to tie pretty closely into what you said before about working with energy medicine, how you really found deep healing.
Yeah, and I love that word alchemy. I use that a lot in my Ayurvedic yoga training, and I use that a lot in my life. And I see everything through the eyes of alchemy, everything through the eyes of, if we have this and this and we transform it, what do we get? For me, I remember earlier on being in the depths of despair at the doctor's office, bawling my eyes out and so angry, tears coming down my face and so mad. And I just said, I'm going to have a good effing life. And I was so determined to not let someone else's choice and actions ruin my life. And saying that didn't make it any easier. There was a long, dark process that I had to move through and live through. And I feel gratitude, I feel appreciation, I feel forgiveness, I feel understanding through my own choice. I chose that. And we all have the opportunity to choose what we do with what has happened to us in our life. And that's really the basis of my book, Living After Loss, is what do we do with our losses, right? And what do you want to do with them? And how can we shift from victimhood into a place that is more empowered in our life and in our life challenges? Because we're all going to lose. We're all going to lose something we love. So what do we do with that loss? And that's the alchemy of it. And it's not that one way is better or worse than another. It's not that, oh, look, I've shifted things and I'm doing better than someone else. It's not like that at all. Because I think we're all learning in the time frame that we need. Some people, it might take 30 years. Some people, it might take 3 years. Some people, there's no right or wrong in it. But for me, I just decided I'm so tired of feeling this way. I'm so sick of feeling mad about what happened. And I'm so sick of feeling depressed. And I'm so tired of feeling trapped and feeling like a victim to this life circumstance. And I talk about this often is people's pain isn't big enough. Sometimes people don't change because their pain isn't big enough. And what I mean by that is, I might have a client come for Ayurvedic healing and want to look at what's going on symptomatically in their body. And I'll give them recommendations and we'll work together. And what I've noticed in the past has happened is people won't necessarily do the recommendations. They won't actually do the things that are necessary to change their health or change how they're feeling in their life. And it's like the pain isn't bad enough. But you can be sure that when someone gets the diagnosis or when someone hits their rock bottom, that's our opportunity. And I don't think we have to go to those dark places to change. But unfortunately, many of us humans, it takes something really big to shake us up and wake us up to go, oh my gosh, I need to make a change. I need to make it now, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And I feel that something within me just had that desire. I didn't know what that was going to look like. I didn't know how to do it, but I was like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to heal because I want to get out of this pain.
And was yoga and meditation and Ayurveda a part of your life in that moment or not yet?
Those have been parts of my life for so many years, for over 20 years now, that they were there and maybe they provided a strong foundation. But initially, no, I couldn't meditate. I couldn't do yoga. I could just shake and try and get through a day. I was in survival. I was just surviving, trying to survive. But yes. And those practices were so influential, I think, in kind of bringing me back to wholeness. And I talk about some of these practices at the back of the book of yoga, of Ayurveda, of Bach flower remedies, of meditation, and these practices. And I see them as tools. And it's like, okay, what's the tool for the job now? So for me, as I mentioned earlier, right in the beginning, the tool of meditation was not useful. In fact, it would have been harmful. But later on, I was able to weave that back in. And later on, I was able to start doing my practice again. And then I had the tools of Ayurveda to be like, oh, wow, my digestive fire, my Agni is completely out. Okay, I need some ginger tea. I need to have some soup. I need to do these things to get my whole being back in balance. So I'm grateful for all of these practices. And for people listening that are like, oh, well, I'm not really in a major trauma. Now is the time to create a strong foundation for your nervous system, for your life, for your mind, for your emotional body, so that we don't wait until things fall apart before we go, okay, well, now I'm going to start doing all these things. It's, in a way, I don't want to say too late, but definitely it's a little bit too late. We need to work preventatively as much as possible to create a foundation so that when challenges come in our life, because they will come, we have something to return to. And we've already built up a strong enough foundation that our nervous system is in a good state so we can adapt and have more inherent resiliency.
When you talked about energy medicine earlier, what does that mean? What does that look like? You were doing Reiki on yourself. You were doing, a chakra healing type practice. Can you talk us through what you mean by that term?
Mm-hmm. So previous to my partner's death, I had studied and trained in bioenergy healing. So I luckily had some amazing friends and colleagues who came and did bioenergy healing on me. I've also been trained in something called theta healing, which looks at going to the root cause, looking at core beliefs that are often subconscious belief systems running the show, and going in and clearing those and essentially reprogramming my psyche, my nervous system, my energy body with supportive healing belief systems. So that's something called theta healing that I also do. So these are the practices that worked for me, and I needed external support initially. I couldn't do them on myself in the beginning stages.
So listeners, we're coming back with Melanie on Thursday, and we're going to talk a bit more about everything she shared on today's episode. And Melanie, thank you for being here and sharing all of this with us. And on Thursday, we're going to talk about resiliency, because I do think that, we as human beings are so resilient, and that there's tools and techniques on how we can tap into that inner strength, inner inner resiliency. So Melanie is going to be sharing and talking to us about that. So we're really hoping that you'll tune in on Thursday so we can share all that knowledge with you. And, for right now, just take a deep breath. I think, ingest, this is a big topic, important episode, and try to maybe think about some loss in your life that has gone unacknowledged, or maybe there's one very obvious, blatant one staring you in the face. But as we talked about in this episode, it's often little things that accumulate that we don't take the time to fully acknowledge. So my hope is that you take some time to do that today, and I'm sending you so much love. I'll hopefully connect with you in Thursday's episode, and namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.